Yo, what's up guys, Alpha, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Phyrexia All Will Be One. So this is going to be the new set that releases on Arena on February the 7th, and in this set review I'm going to be specifically covering cards that I think have potential to see play in Arena's Eternal format, so specifically Explorer and Historic. So rather than going through every single card in the set, which would take forever and be pretty boring, what I've done is just I've gone through the entire spoiler and picked out any cards that I think have potential to see play in Historic or Explorer. I'm going to go through the cards, talk about what I think of them, what decks they could potentially fit in. There are going to be some cards that I think are sideboard options, and then later in the video I'm also going to be covering some cards that don't necessarily have a home right now, but are worth bearing in mind going future as more cards get added to the format. So let's just get straight into it. So starting off with the 5 new Fastlands in the format. So they finally finished the Fastlands cycle, and I'm so happy to see this. So Fastlands, if you're not familiar, are 2-color lands that enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands. So these are specifically very nice for 2-color aggro decks, because obviously in an aggro deck you want to be curving out, you want your early lands to be entering untapped. That also produces mana of both colours. So in this set we're getting the black-red one, the red-green one, the blue-black one, the green-white one, and the white-blue one. And there are definitely aggro decks or just low-to-the-ground decks that would want to take benefit of this. I think the black-red one could see play in the sacrifice decks. Red-green is obviously just an aggressive colour in general, so I'm sure the Gruul aggro decks will be happy to see this. Blue-black, we have decks like Ninjas and Historic, which will probably like this as well. Green-white, you obviously have decks like Humans, which are pretty low to the ground as well. Not sure whether Humans will want this, but we'll see. And then blue-white, maybe Affinity could want this, or maybe Auras as well. So I think there's a number of really good aggro decks that would want to take advantage of this. Building low-to-the-ground aggro decks in these colours has always been a bit awkward in the past, especially if you have 1-drops or 2-drops in both colours. And the other sort of decks that I think would benefit from this is 3-color low-to-the-ground decks as well. We've seen a number of Grixis decks in Historic, for example, that run like Death Shadow or Ledger Shredder and like a bunch of cheap spells in all 3 colours, and the mana base has always been the weakest part of those sorts of decks, so I'm sure those sorts of decks will benefit from it as well. Either way, I'm really happy to see these lands added to the format, and I think a lot of the low to the ground decks will be very happy to run them. And next up we've got Skrelv Defector Mite. So this is a 1-mana 1/1 legendary artifact creature, Phyrexian Mite, has Toxic 1, which is a new keyword. Basically the way this works is players dealt combat damage by this creature also get a poison counter. Now full disclosure, I don't think Toxic is going to be relevant in this. In fact, no other Toxic cards out of the set really stuck out to me as cards that I think are going to see play in Historic and Explorer, and I don't think it's any different for this one, because we're mainly interested in the other ability of this. So it can't block, and the ability we're interested in is for a Phyrexian white mana, so that's either white or 2 life. And tapping it, you choose a colour, and another target creature you control gains Toxic 1 and hexproof from that colour until the end of turn. And it can't be blocked by creatures of that colour this turn either. So this is kind of comparable to, older cards like Mother of Runes and Giver of Runes. And this is the first time that we really get this sort of effect in Historic and Explorer, So I think there are a number of decks that could be potentially interested in this. First of all is Mardu Greasefang, because, Greasefang is a deck where you really want to protect your Greasefang. I think the most common way that opponents are going to be trying to stop your combo when you're playing Greasefang is with instant speed creature removal. Obviously Graveyard Hate is an issue as well, but for the most part, people are going to be running more creature removal than they are Graveyard Hate, so having this as a way to protect your Greasefang to allow you to combo off seems really nice. Specifically in Mardu Greasefang, the fact that this is an artifact is really nice as well, because it works really nicely with Goblin Engineer, which seems like a key part of the sort of plan B of this deck. So if you don't have the Greasefang, you could play this and then sacrifice it to Engineer to get back a Dragon Engine to refuel your hand or something. So definitely something I'm going to be trying in Mardu Greasefang. Since it is legendary, I don't think you're going to be wanting more than 1 or 2 copies, but I'm definitely going to be trying it there to see if it helps. Auras is definitely a deck that I think could be interested in this. Now, it does kind of compete specifically with Selfless Savior, so if this does see play in Auras, probably again a 1 or 2 of, because it's legendary, maybe in place of Savior. Now, it's not clear which is the better option here. There is definitely advantages of Savior over this. The fact that Savior doesn't need to untap to activate its effect is really big, so Selfless Savior is generally a better top deck. If you already have a core Spirit Dancer or a Light Pause in play, drawing a Selfless Savior off the top is really nice, because you can play it and immediately sacrifice it to protect your creature. And again, that makes it better with Lurrus as well, because if you play Lurrus and get Selfless Savior back, you can immediately protect the Lurrus from Selfless Savior. But, the advantage of Skrelv over Selfless Savior is that it's repeatable, so you don't need to sacrifice it to protect something. You can just tap it. So, you might not necessarily need to bring back the Skrelv from the graveyard because it doesn't sacrifice itself, but I'm not really sure how often that's going to come up, because if the opponent does have single target removal, they can just use it to kill the Skrelv instead. The other advantages of Skrelv over Savior, though, is first of all, it gives you protection from exiling effects like Skyclave Apparition, which is definitely relevant. You know, having the opponent exile your Lurrus or your Core Spirit Dancer, Selfless Save, you can't do anything about that. And the other nice upside of this is that it also, you know, it says it can't be blocked by creatures of that colour this turn as well. So not only does it help protect your creatures from removal, but you can also use it to help your big creature get through. So, you know, say for example, you've got a Core Spirit Dancer and you haven't found a flying aura or an unblockable aura, and the opponent is just chump blocking you every turn. The ability to, you know, if the opponent's playing a mono-coloured deck, make it unblockable from that colour also helps you attack in as well. So again, there's strengths and weaknesses of both cards of this and Selfless Savior, so I'm not sure which is correct, but it's definitely a consideration for auras, I think. And then the third deck that I think it could see play, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but is Kethis Combo, because this does tick a lot of boxes for Kethis Combo. It's a legendary creature, which that deck wants as many legendary creatures as possible. It can protect your creatures, which is really valuable in that deck. You know, protecting your Kethis and your Emry is really nice as well. It's also an artifact, so it reduces the cost of Emry. So there's a lot going on that could make this good in Kethis, but I'm not 100% sure because needing white on turn 1 in a 4-colour deck is going to be pretty difficult to set up. It's not that great to bring back with Emry unless you have Tyvar, that I'll get to in a second. You know, compared to something like Hope of Girapur that you can just loop with Emry and is colourless. So I'm not 100% sure about Kethis, but it's definitely a consideration there as well. So yeah, mainly for Mardu, Greasefang and Auras, I'm going to be trying this. Potentially Kethis Combo as well. But in general, you know, since we haven't had a Giver of Runes or Mother of Runes style effect, it is an interesting option if any decks come up in future where you need to be able to repeatedly protect your creatures. Next up, we've got Tyvar Jubilant Brawler. So this is a new 3-mana Planeswalker in Golgari colours, enters with 3 loyalty, and it has a passive ability. You may activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste. +1, untap up to 1 target creature, and -2, mill 3 cards, then you may return a creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the passive ability on this is really strong. We haven't had an ability like this in Historic or Explorer. The main place I'm really excited for this, first of all in Historic, but I guess also in Explorer as well, is in Elves. You know, I say Historic slightly more because we have Elvish Archdruid in the format. You know, you do have Circle of Dreams Druid in Explorer as well, but I think this is going to be much better in Historic where you have Archdruid in addition to Circle of Dreams Druid, because the big issue with Elves in Historic is that most of the deck strategy revolves around untapping with an Archdruid or Circle of Dreams Druid, and considering the format is pretty interactive right now, that's very difficult to do. Whereas having a Tyvar in play, you can just play your Archdruid and immediately tap it for a bunch of mana, which is so powerful and can lead to really explosive starts. You know, if you're able to go Llanowar Elves or Elvish Mystic on turn 1, into Tyvar on turn 2, then play the Archdruid, tap it immediately, then you can untap it with the Tyvar, play more Elves, tap it again. You could flood the board insanely quickly. And another big issue with Elves as a deck in general is that it's very vulnerable to board sweepers, so having more good playable Planeswalkers that you actively want to run really helps to start mitigating that weakness as well. You know, it makes you less vulnerable to Divine Purge and Supreme Verdict and stuff like that, so I'm definitely going to be trying this in Elves. Also, being in black does give you some decent options in Elves as well. You know, one card that I've been tempted to run in Elves for quite a while is Skemfar Avenger, which makes the deck better against Brotherhood's End and Supreme Verdict. Obviously doesn't help against Divine Purge, but there are definitely some benefits from being in black in Elves as well. Outside of Elves, another deck that I'm interested in this for is Kethis Combo. You know, being able to use this to activate your Emry immediately is really sick with the passive ability. That deck also usually runs some number of Rezug, you know, maybe 1 or 2 or something like that, so being able to activate Rezug is nice. You can untap the creature, so you know you can play Emry, bring something back, untap it with Tyvar, bring something else back, and the -2, milling 3 cards for a start. You want to be milling a bunch of cards in Kethis because it's a very graveyard-based combo deck, and then you can get back a 2-drop as well, so you know, obviously there's Diligent Excavator, there's Lazav, there's the new Skrelv if you're running that. You know, you can bring Skrelv back and immediately activate it because of the passive ability, so I think this is definitely going to see playing Kethis Combo in some numbers. Not sure how many really, because that deck is already pretty tight for space, but definitely think it's going to be good there. And then there are also some more fringe cards that work really nicely with Tyvar. Prime Speaker Vannifar is a card that has always been really held back by the fact that you have to untap with it, and it's 4 mana. And, you know, you can combo off pretty effectively with Vannifar, and having this as a way to enable you to immediately go off is pretty sick. Now, I don't think a dedicated Vannifar combo deck is going to be particularly good, but I have seen some recent Pioneer lists. I think I saw Joel Larson recently playing a humans deck that has, you know, a pretty decent humans core, and then you can use Vannifar to sacrifice a 1-drop to get Corridor Monitor to untap the Vannifar. Then you sacrifice the Corridor Monitor to get Extraction Specialist back, which gets back the Corridor Monitor to untap the Vannifar. Then you loop Corridor Monitor 3 more times to get 4 Extraction Specialists in play, getting back the Corridor Monitor each time. Then you sacrifice the Monitor to get back 4 to search up 4 Glasspaw Mimics, copying the Extraction Specialist, and then you get Keldon's Strike Team as the last card to give your whole board haste. So it's basically a humans deck that has access to this combo, and Tyvar would mean you'd have to splash an extra colour in the deck, but allowing you to immediately activate Vannifar the turn you play it seems pretty sick there as well. So that's definitely another deck I'm going to be trying out. And just in general, you know, as more cards get added to the format that have strong tap abilities, Tyvar could fit in a lot more shells as well. So I'm definitely excited to try this one out. Next up, we've got Jace the Perfected Mind. So this is another Planeswalker. So this is a Phyrexian Planeswalker. So we can either play it for 4 mana and it enters with 5 loyalty, or play it for 3 mana and 2 life and it enters with 3 loyalty. The +1 until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3, -0. -2, target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards, otherwise you draw a single card. And then -X, target player mills 3 times X cards. So the only deck that I think is likely to be playing this in the main deck anyway is Kethis combo. So this is another card that I'm pretty excited for in Kethis. And the reason for that is that, first of all, it's another way for you to go infinite if you have Kethis and 2 Mox Ambers, because Kethis reduces the cost of this by 1. So if you're paying for this with Phyrexian mana, you only need 2 mana. So if you have 2 Mox Ambers, you can play this Jace, play 1 Mox Amber, tap it for blue, play the second Mox Amber, tap it for blue again, and then you can -X, you can -X for 3 to kill the Jace, milling yourself for 9 cards, and then you can just replay the Jace from the graveyard with Kethis, replay the 2 Mox Ambers, and then just do that over again until you've milled your whole deck out. And then on top of, which is the whole goal of Kethis, right? Once you've milled your whole deck out, you basically just win from that point. And then on top of that, you can also use this as a way to win once you're in that position, right? Because previously in the past, you've either had to win off Diligent Excavator milling the opponent, or with a single copy of Jace Wielder of Mysteries. And Jace Wielder of Mysteries has always felt like a waste of a slot in that deck, whereas Jace acts as, first of all, like I said, a way to just mill your whole deck fairly easily if you have 2 Mox Ambers, but you can also use it as a way to mill the opponent out once you've reached that state in the game as well. So Jace seems like a really great addition to Kethis, in addition to Tyvar, so that's definitely a deck I'm excited to play. Outside of that, you know, the only other place I could see this seeing play is, you know, Mill, maybe, but Mill isn't really a strong deck in Historic at all. And then, you know, maybe this could be in the sideboard of a Rogues deck, or if you wanted to run Blue-Black Control that focused on milling the opponent and then have stuff like Drown in the Lock and Into the Story, it could work there as well. But those, you know, not very good decks, and I don't think Jace is going to be enough to really help push them. So mainly excited for this one in Kethis combo. The next up, we've got Elesh Norn, Mother of the Machines. So this is a 5 mana legendary creature. It's a 4/7 with Vigilance, and if a opponent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of opponent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time, and permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of opponents your opponents control to trigger. So this is obviously, you know, a 5 mana card is a lot in both Explorer and Historic, but the really nice thing about this card is it dodges almost all of the commonly played removal, right? It has 7 toughness, so killing this with red base removal is going to be incredibly difficult. The most commonly played removal outside of that is stuff like Fatal Push and Skyclave Apparition, both of which this misses because it's 5 mana. So unless the opponent is playing like a Go for the Throat or just, you know, a Fateful Absence, for example, this is going to be really, really hard to kill. Now, the main, I don't think this is going to be good in main decks for the most part because it's so expensive, but I definitely think this is a really nice option for sideboards. And the reason for that is that it's a nice card that can shut off particular strategies whilst also running its own enter the battlefield ability. So what I mean by that is there are a lot of decks right now that don't, well, not a lot, but there are some number of decks specifically in Historic right now that can run Hushbringer in the sideboard. You know, they've got stuff like Auras and Thopters, and Hushbringer is a really good card in the Historic metagame right now because it shuts off decks like Goblins, Humans, Angels, Helioke, even Affinity to a lesser extent because it shuts off Ingenious Smith and Thought Monitor. But there aren't that many decks that can run Hushbringer because you need to be running either no or very few enter the battlefield triggers because it obviously shuts off yours as well. But Elesh Norn is a card you could run in the sideboard of a deck that does have its own enter the battlefield triggers that not only shuts off your opponent's stuff but doubles up yours as well. So for example, a deck like Mardu Humans that I covered on the channel recently, that's a deck that has difficult matchups against Angels, Helioke, and Goblins, for example. So you could sideboard this in a Humans deck, like Mardu Humans, and then not only do you shut off a ton of the opponent's deck, against Angels, Helioke, Goblins, it's usually going to be game over for them at that point, but it also doubles up all of your Ranger Captain triggers, all of your Thalia's Lieutenant triggers. Now, obviously, 5 mana is a lot, but specifically in Mardu Humans, you're running Crucius, which you can use to ramp into this on turn 4, so I think this is going to be a really nice sideboard option as a way to as a Torpor Orb effect that just shuts off Enter the Battlefield triggers, that doesn't shut off yours, and not only that, but it doubles up all of yours as well. So very nice sideboard option for decks that have ETB triggers, but struggle against other decks that have ETB triggers, essentially. Then next up, those cards are the cards that I expect to see the most play. Next up, I'm going to talk about some slightly more fringe cards that are going to see play in kind of particular decks, if that makes sense. So next up, we've got Tyvar Stand. So this is an instant that costs X and a green, and it says target creature you control gets X+X+X and gains hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn. So we've obviously seen effects like this in the past. You got Tamio Safekeeping and Snakeskin Veil and stuff like that. And I definitely think that this is the best out of all of them, because not only does it act as a protection spell for 1 mana, you don't need you can play this for X equals 0 as just a 1 mana protection spell, which not that many decks are running that sort of effect, but there will be decks, specifically green creature decks, that will want this against removal heavy decks. And this definitely feels like the best out of all of those style of effects, because you can use it as a way to force extra damage through as well. Primal Might is probably the best removal spell in green. I definitely think this is the best protection spell in green, because it has that flexibility to be able to pump your creatures to not only, force lethal damage through if the opponent doesn't have any blockers, but blow out the opponent in combat as well. If they flash in a creature and then block, you can activate this to pump your creature and give it indestructible, so it just kills the opponent's creature. So if you're interested in these sort of cheap green protection effects, Tyvar Stand definitely feels like the most flexible and the best out of the ones that we've had in the format so far. Next up, we've got Sheoldred's Edict. So this is a really interesting removal spell. So it's a 2 mana instant, and you choose one. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature, each opponent sacrifices a creature token, or each opponent sacrifices a planeswalker. So generally 2 mana edicts haven't been that good, but the fact that this can kill planeswalkers is really appealing. Typically if it was just a 2 mana edict that forces the opponent to sack a creature, that's not great, but I feel like there are a lot of decks that struggle to cleanly deal with planeswalkers. We don't have Dreadbore in Historic or Explorer, so if you're interested in that sort of effect, I think this is as close as you're going to get. And it does seem pretty playable to me. Having an edict effect over a removal spell is very nice against creatures like Graveyard Trespasser, for example, that is difficult to target. So I definitely think that certain decks are going to be interested in this, mainly if you're interested in the Planeswalker mode. I think, you're not super interested in this just to kill creatures, but if your deck struggles to cleanly kill Planeswalkers, this seems like a great addition there. So yeah, I could definitely see this seeing play in a number of decks, specifically if you struggle against Planeswalkers. Next up, we've got Ossification. So this is a 2 mana enchantment aura. Enchant basic land you control, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until Ossification leaves the battlefield. So this is a really interesting removal spell. Typically 2 mana white auras have some kind of drawback. Baffling End, for example, only kills smaller creatures, and it can't kill planeswalkers. The fact that this can kill any creature or planeswalker for 2 mana is really nice. This is kind of comparable to Chain to the Rocks, which we don't have in either Explorer or Historic, and it requires you to be playing a lot of mountains. This just requires you to be playing a decent number of basic lands, so there are a number of decks that I could see this seeing play in. First of all is Enchantress in Historic. I think Enchantress in Historic has always not had great interaction. Baffling End is a card that sees a lot of play in that deck, and that is significantly worse than this because, I guess the weakness or the strength of Baffling End over an enchantment like this is if Baffling End dies, the opponent doesn't get the card back, but for the same amount of mana, this being able to take out any creature of any size or any planeswalker is huge. That deck doesn't have great ways to kill planeswalkers outside of usually like the one-off Banishing Light that they can get off Sterling Grove. And in Selesnya Enchantress and Historic, that deck is running a lot of basics because it's only a 2-color deck, so I definitely think it could see play there as just a really flexible removal spell in general. I also potentially think it could see, or I know this deck doesn't exist, but I'm definitely going to be trying a mono-white control deck because this, in addition to Laydown Arms, gives you really, really good quality removal, and then you could just run some good Planeswalkers or just generally good cards that help to run away with the game. So I'm not sure if mono-white is going to, like, mid-range or mono-white control is going to be good enough, but having this in addition to lay down arms gives mono-white a really strong suite of removal. Having said that, you know, if you are a mono-white deck, you don't necessarily need to be mid-range or control. You know, you could run this as, you know, copies 6 through 8 of lay down arms. Maybe it's even better than lay down arms if you care about being able to exile planeswalkers. So this seems like a really nice addition to the format, specifically if you're in a 2-color deck like Enchantress, or a mono-color deck if you're mono white. Speaking of mono white, we've got Phyrexian Vindicator. So this is basically the white version of Phyrexian Obliterator. It's a 5/5 flyer, and if damage would be dealt to it, prevent that damage, and when damage is prevented this way, it deals that much damage to any other target. So this is a pretty nice card. Again, like, I think this is only really going to see play if a mono-white mid-range or control deck is around, which is why I wanted to talk about this card in conjunction with Ossification. You know, there is a chance that a white mid-range or control deck is viable with lay down arms and Ossification, and Vindicator seems like a really, really powerful card against opposing creature decks. Now, obviously the big weakness of this is it does just die to Fatal Push, which is a big deal. You know, it also gets stopped by the Stomp Side of Bone Crusher Giant, or the damage prevention that does get stopped by that, but it seems pretty nice. Additionally, if mono-white Devotion becomes the deck, this seems like a shoo-in for there as well. So even though mono-white mid-range, Devotion, Control, whatever, isn't really a deck right now, if it is because of cards like Lay Down Arms and Ossification, I think this is going to be a great addition there, but I think the mana is it's going to be too restrictive to play this in a deck that isn't mono-white. Next up, we've got some additions for a potential Colossus Hammer deck. Now, I do want to preface this by saying that I don't think the cards we're getting in this set are enough for Colossus Hammer to be a good deck, but it's definitely worth noting because obviously, you know, Hammer Time is a really powerful modern deck right now, so any new tools that we get that sort of deck closer to being good is worth talking about, I think. So Colossus Hammer is, you know, an artifact that gives a creature +10/+10 and loses flying. Now, obviously, the big drawback of it has equip 8, but if you can cheat on that, then it becomes a really, really powerful, fast combo deck in a way. Now, we don't have Sigarda's Aid, which is probably the thing that's holding this deck back in general. We do have Resolute Strike as a way to equip warriors, and we did get a nice new addition in the set that kind of works as a combo hill with Colossus Hammer. So this is Cacophony Scamp. It's a 1-mana 1/1 Phyrexian Goblin Warrior, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it if you do Proliferate, and when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So the combo here is you play Scamp on turn 1, then you can play Colossus Hammer, and because it's a warrior, you know, it's a Phyrexian Goblin Warrior, you can use Resolute Strike to attach the Colossus Hammer to the Scamp, attack with it, and then it deals, it'd be 11 damage. Oh no, wait, does it add to +10/+10? Yeah, so it would be 11 damage, and then you can sacrifice it to deal 11 again, so that's 22 damage on turn 2, which is pretty insane. Now, having said that, I don't think the deck has enough consistent pieces for that to be reliable enough right now, but we did also get another card in the set that helps with redundancy for equipping the Colossus Hammer, and that is Kemba, Kha Enduring. So this is a 2-mana 2/2, and when it or another cat enters the battlefield under your control, attach up to one target equipment you control to that creature. Equipped creatures you control get +1/+1, and then you can pay 5 to create a 2/2 white cat creature token. So, like I said, we only really have Resolute Strike in either format as a way to cheat Hammer on, but Kemba kind of gets around that because you can play this once Colossus Hammer's in play and equip it immediately. Then if you have spare mana later in the game, you can start creating cat tokens, which can equip the Colossus Hammer to immediately. Now again, you know, even though I think this is interesting, I'm pretty skeptical that Colossus Hammer will be consistent or good enough because we don't really have good ways to tutor up the Colossus Hammer. We don't have Stoneforge Mystic or anything like that. And, you know, both of these are very vulnerable to single target interaction like Fatal Push, which is quite popular right now. So I do think that it's interesting we're getting these cards, and it does get us closer to Colossus Hammer being good, which I think is worth talking about. But if I had to guess, I don't think this deck is going to be consistent enough or viable right now, but it's definitely worth trying out, I think. Next up, we've got Solphim Mayhem Dominus. So this is a 5-mana 5/4 legendary creature Phyrexian Horror, and if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or opponent instead. And then you can pay 1 and 2 red of Phyrexian mana and discard 2 cards to put an indestructible counter on it. So the first thing that came to mind with this is that this seems like a pretty good replacement for Torbran, and Torbran does see play in the mono-red aggro decks. Now, there are obviously a few differences. I think in general this is probably better than Torbran because it doesn't need to be a red source for a start, so you could run this in a multicolored aggro deck. it's, generally much safer because you can protect it as well, right? If the opponent tries to kill a Torbran with a Fatal Push, you don't really have a good way to play around that, whereas you can protect this, which seems pretty sick. Putting an indestructible counter on this against a deck like Rakdos midrange seems really, really powerful. So if you are going to be running mono red, I do think this is a decent replacement for Torbran. Now, having said that, I don't think mono red aggro is a particularly good deck, and I'm not sure replacing Torbran with this is really going to push it that far ahead, but it's definitely an interesting option, and I do think the indestructible counter on this is going to be difficult for Rakdos midrange specifically to deal with, and that does seem like one of the most popular decks right now, so there's a chance that this could be a great addition to the mono red deck, which is nice. Next up, we've got Thrun, Breaker of Silence. This is a 5-mana 5/5 legendary creature, can't be countered, has trample, and it can't be the target of non-green spells your opponent control or abilities from non-green sources your opponents control, and as long as it's your turn, it has indestructible. So I don't think this is going to see main deck play at all, but as a sideboard card, this seems really nice against control. Now, I've really struggled with good green sideboard cards against control for a while. For a decent amount of time, I felt like Shifting Ceratops was the best option, but ever since Wandering Emperor was printed, that card has always felt so lackluster because, you can play a Shifting Ceratops, the opponent can't counter it, you can give it haste and then attack, but the opponent can just flash in Wandering Emperor and exile it. You really need your creature to not be vulnerable to most types of interaction that control are running, and Thrun really helps to do that a lot. It can't be countered, which is, the most important thing. I don't think a green sideboard card against control is good enough unless it says can't be countered. It has trample, so it can't just be chump blocked by Wandering Emperor tokens, and it can't be targeted by Wandering Emperor, it can't be targeted by Fateful Absence, it can't be tucked by Teferi, it can't be targeted with March of Otherworldly Light. It has indestructible during your turn, so even if the opponent did have a way to kill it, it will have indestructible. So the only way the opponent has of killing this is with Supreme Verdict, basically. And if blue-white control, I feel like from my experience, blue-white control is still mainly running Divine Purge as its sweeper of choice. So if you are running a green deck, this seems like a great option against control, assuming Supreme Verdict isn't super popular. If Supreme Verdict is really popular, then this might not cut it, but if Divine Purge is the main sweeper of choice in Historic, this seems like a great choice. In Explorer, I think, Supreme Verdict is the Wrath of choice, but this still might be good enough there because the opponent has to have a Wrath to kill this. Nothing else works, really. So if you are running a green deck, I think this is the best sideboard card against control that we have in green in the format right now. So really, really great option for green decks to help improve their matchup against control, which is nice. And next up, we've got Green Sun's Twilight. So this is a sorcery, costs X and green, reveal the top X +1 cards of your library, choose a creature card and or a land card from among them, put those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If X is 5 or more, instead put the chosen cards onto the battlefield or into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is a really interesting option, specifically for mono green devotion, as a way to help you find your Nykthos more consistently. Now, I don't think this is as good as Oath of Nissa, because Oath of Nissa adding to your devotion count is really, really huge, but obviously we don't have Oath of Nissa in Explorer or Historic, so if you did want to run a card to help you find your Nykthos, I think this is a fairly decent option. You can potentially play this for just 1 mana if you really need to find a land, for example, because you get to look at the top card. And as long as your deck isn't full of Planeswalkers, this is pretty consistently going to be able to hit. And then once you do have Nykthos online, you can pump a lot more. You can make X 5 or more and potentially just put like a Cavalier of Thorns straight onto the battlefield or something like that. So I'm not 100% sure if this is going to be good enough to see play in Devotion, but it's definitely an interesting option to help you dig for, your Nykthos. Even if you don't find your Nykthos, you could find like an Old Growth Troll or something, which really helps. So definitely an interesting option for the Devotion decks. Obviously, if you're running a green ramp deck, other than that, this could also be useful as well. But I feel like if you're running green ramp in either format, Devotion is the way to go right now. So I'm definitely going to be testing this out in Devotion. Not 100% sure it's good enough. It is a bit awkward that it doesn't give you Devotion itself, but I'm definitely going to be testing it out and see how it performs. Next up, I've got a few cards that I think are powerful, but don't necessarily have a good home right now. Starting off with Nahiri the Unforgiving. So this is another Phyrexian Planeswalker, so we can either play this for 4 mana and it enters with 5 loyalty, or for 3 mana and it enters with 3 loyalty. +1 until your next turn, up to 1 target creature attacks a player each combat if possible. The other +1, discard a card, then draw a card, and then 0, exile target creature or equipment card with mana value less than Nahiri's loyalty from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of it. That token gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. So, first of all, the first +1, if you're running a creature heavy deck, which I think the only way you can possibly run this is if you're running a creature heavy deck, this does sometimes just enable you to eat your opponent's creatures in combo. If the opponent has a problematic card that you have a bigger creature for, you just +1 and you're able to block it in combat. You can also use it to just protect Nahiri in general. If the opponent only has one creature in play, you can use it to force that creature to attack you instead of Nahiri. So that +1 kind of defends Nahiri a little bit, but it's not great because it's dealing you damage anyway. The other +1 to discard and draw a card is pretty nice because it helps fuel the 0. I think the 0 ability on this is the most powerful thing, and Nahiri kind of enables itself by that. The other nice thing about this +1 is it also doesn't require you to discard in order to draw, so if you're Hellbent, it's just +1 to draw a card, which is really nice. But like I said, I think the 0 is the main thing we're interested in here. Exile target creature. Basically, you can use this as like a repeatable reanimation effect, assuming Nahiri's loyalty isn't going down constantly. So if I had to pick a home for this, I don't think this is probably a main deckable card, but it seems pretty nice as a sideboard card in a deck that's running creatures with a lot of nice enter the battlefield triggers. So, this could be used with Bloodtithe Harvester, it could be used with Seasoned Pyromancer in Historic. So, maybe if you're running a red-white mid-range deck, or, I don't know if this is good enough to see play in Mardu Humans. Potentially if you wanted a card specifically for the slower matchups in a deck like Mardu Humans, this could be nice at getting back Thalia's Lieutenants and Ranger Captain of Eos's and stuff like that. So I think this is a really nice card because as a 3-mana Planeswalker, it's actually pretty difficult to break up, right? The reanimation ability on Planeswalkers is usually going to be a minus. So the fact that it's a 0 and you can just keep doing it every single turn makes it so that if you repeatedly bring back creatures, that is going to be good enough to protect the Nahiri. So it needs to be in a creature-heavy deck. Not sure it's good enough for the main deck because it is going to be, the very, very fast aggressive decks are usually going to be able to attack it down. But as a sideboard card against control or mid-range, this does seem pretty nice. But again, I'm not really sure there's a great home for it right now in either format, but definitely one I'm going to be keeping an eye on going forwards. And next up, we've got the Mycosynth Gardens. So this is a land, taps to add a colourless. You can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any colour. So it does fix your mana, but it costs you to do that. The main thing we're interested in here is the other ability. So we can pay X and tap it to have it become a copy of target non-token artifacts you control with mana value X. So again, this is another card that I think has a lot of potential, but doesn't really have a great home right now. Now, there aren't that many dedicated artifact decks in Explorer. There are a few in Historic, and, the main cards I could see this being good to copy are, stuff like Retrofit a Foundry. Getting an additional Foundry is really nice because you can start chaining them more quickly. You could also use it to copy stuff like Nettlecyst if you're playing Affinity. So this could maybe see play in Affinity. I'm not really sure though because, I think the artifact lands are generally a bit more valuable because they allow you to get your Thought Monitor into play quicker, but that could be a potential home immediately. And then this definitely seems like kind of a sleeper card. As if there's a deck that's built around an artifact, like, obviously in Modern you have Amulet of Vigor. So if there's an artifact that gets printed and a deck is built around that in future, this definitely could be a really nice addition to those sorts of decks to copy the key artifact in that deck. So this is definitely one to keep an eye on as well. And then next up, we've got Capricious Hellraiser. So this is a 6 mana 4/4, costs 3 less to cast if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard, has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard, choose a non-creature non-land card from among them and copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So again, I think this is a card that is worth talking about because it has a very high ceiling, but I'm not sure it has a great home right now. Obviously, in both formats, you could very easily fill your graveyard quite quickly. Not as fast as a format like Modern where you have like Mishra's Bauble or fetch lands, but you can still get the discount on this fairly consistently. But I'm not sure, I think the best decks at filling the graveyard in both formats is it Phoenix, and I'm not sure this is going to want to see play over, Ledger Shredder or Crackling Drake or, any of the cards that are in the current Phoenix build. So I think that's the most natural home for it, but I don't think it's as good as options that we currently have available. The thing that excites me about this card is it does have kind of combo potential, right? So the enter the battlefield trigger, you can respond to it by exiling stuff from your own graveyard. So I've seen some people talk about using this alongside Dig Through Time in Pioneer Phoenix, where you could cast this, then with the trigger on the stack, activate Dig Through Time and exile loads of stuff from your graveyard so that you're guaranteed to hit a powerful spell. It also works that way with Unlicensed Her, so there could be a way that you can use this to cheat into play a really big spell like Portals of Phyrexia or something crazy like that. that seems quite convoluted right now. I think the best application for this card, if it does have a home, is to just play it fairly in a deck that's good at filling up the graveyard quite quickly. But again, right now, I'm not sure it has great homes. I think if you are playing additional creatures in Phoenix, you don't want them to be vulnerable to graveyard hate, right? If the opponent plays Rest in Peace or Unlicensed Hearse, not only does that shut down your Phoenix, but it also shuts off the discount on this. So I'm not sure this has a great home right now, but I think this card is powerful enough that it's worth talking about, and I wouldn't be surprised if this does see play at some point in future. So those are the main cards that I think have potential to see play. Next up are a few cards that I think are a little bit more niche, but are worth talking about as well. Starting off here with Glissa Sunslayer. So actually, maybe this one's not as niche. I think this one definitely could have potential to see play. So this is a 3-mana 3/3 legendary creature with First Strike and Death Touch. It's a Phyrexian zombie elf, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you either draw a card and lose a life, destroy an enchantment, or remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. So first of all, First Strike and Death Touch are a hell of a combination of keywords together. So that alone makes it really, really difficult to ever attack past, to profitably block ever. So that's really nice. And then obviously if the opponent, they've either got to just chuck something in the way of this, or you start getting card advantage. The ability for this to just draw, killing enchantments is always going to be valuable as long as stuff like Fable of the Mirror Breaker is around. And then removing the 3 counters in the context of this set is probably meant to help against poison counters, but it does also, work against planeswalkers, so you could just attack the opponent directly and then use the ability to kill a planeswalker that has 3 or less loyalty as well. So this seems like a very generically powerful card. Again, I'm not really sure there's a great home for it. It is a zombie and an elf. Zombie isn't really a playable tribe in either format. Elf is, but I'm not really sure. I mean, maybe an Explorer where you're not as all in on the mana generating plan. This could see play in Golgari Elves there, maybe. In Historic, I think the Elves deck is so built, especially with Tyvar, around getting Archdruid into play and tapping it for a bunch of mana. I don't really think you'd be interested in playing this as a 3-drop. Outside of that, there are Jund mid-range decks in Historic. You could maybe think about splashing green in Rakdos midrange in Explorer, but I'm not really sure this is a good enough card on its own to dedicate a green splash. But like I said in Historic, green is already a splash for stuff like Tarmogoyf and additional removal, and stuff like potentially Minskamboo as well. So I could potentially see this seeing play in mid-range decks as well, but I'm not 100% sure that it's worth, better than Rakdos mid-range, but it's definitely one keeping an eye on. Very, very generically powerful card here. And next up, we've got Tyrranax Rex. So this is a 7-mana 8/8, can't be countered, trample, ward 4, haste, and toxic 4. So this is a really, really big creature for the mana cost. Like I said earlier, I think Thrun is the better sideboard option if you want to improve your matchup against control, mainly just because it's so much cheaper, but I do think this could potentially see play in the sideboard of Mono Green Devotion if you're running Grizzled Huntmaster. So in Historic Mono Green Devotion, I have been testing with Grizzled Huntmaster, and I do think this is a potentially powerful way to build the deck, because it allows you to cash in any Llanowar Elves or Elvish Mystics that you have in your hand for a bigger creature. And I think you do want something in the sideboard that you can fetch off this that is good against control. And obviously in Devotion, maybe you want to run Thrun instead, just because there's a chance that you don't have access to 7 mana. But if you do have access to 7 mana against control, and you can fetch Tyrranax Rex off the Grizzled Huntmaster, this seems like so much more powerful in that sort of matchup, because the big weakness of Thrun is if the opponent has Supreme Verdict, they can kill it before it really starts doing any damage, whereas the fact that this has haste means that you can just play this, immediately kill a Planeswalker by attacking. It's basically impossible for them to deal with at instant speed because of the ward 4. And so if you didn't want to run Thrun and you're you're confident you can consistently get to 7 mana off your Devotion deck, this seems like a nice fetchable option off the Huntmaster. And if in general you're running a deck that you're confident that you can hit 7 mana in, this seems like a better option than Thrun. But since Thrun's 5 mana, which is a lot more easy to achieve, I think Thrun is generally going to be more favoured in just generic sideboards. While we're also talking about Devotion, Conduit of Worlds and Mirran Safehouse are interesting options in the Khan sideboard for Devotion decks, mainly as a way to get back Nykthos from the graveyard. One of the main ways that decks have of interacting with the Devotion deck is killing the Nykthos, right? Whether that's with Field of Ruin or Assassin's Trophy or something like that. Or, you can always mill it over with Cavalier of Thorns or something as well. So if you do want a card to be able to get Nykthos back from the graveyard, Conduit of Worlds seems like a nice choice, because you can play it, then play Nykthos from the graveyard, and it also gives you this additional effect where you can choose target non-opponent in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. and if you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. So if you do run out of gas, which can be an issue with Mono Green Devotion, particularly against the discard decks, being able to get this with Khan, get back a Nykthos from the graveyard and then just start casting, creatures or planeswalkers that have died earlier in the game, seems like a decent option. Now, obviously, the Khan sideboard in Mono Green Devotion is already packed full. It's really hard to find space, but having this as a way to bring back Nykthos from the graveyard is pretty interesting. A card that I think does the same thing right now, but slightly worse, is Mirran Safehouse. So this is a 3-mana artifact, and as long as it's on the battlefield, it has the activated abilities of all lands in all graveyards. So you could play this if Nykthos is in your graveyard and just use it as a Nykthos effect, but generally I think Conduit of Worlds is better because it has this extra ability as well. The reason why I wanted to bring up Mirran Safehouse in addition to that is that I think this is kind of another sleeper card that's worth just bearing in mind at the back of your mind, because as more lands get entered into the as more lands get entered into both formats, there is combo potential with this card. If you're milling a bunch of lands into the graveyard, there could be some combination of lands that do a really, really powerful thing with the safe house. But for now, I don't really think it's gonna see much play in either format, but it's definitely another one that's worth bearing in mind. While we're on the topic of the Khan sideboard, we've got the Filigree Sylex here, which is a 2-mana legendary artifact. And basically, this is the same as Ratchet Bomb, but it also has the ability to deal 10 damage to any target if you remove 10 oil counters off it. So if you're interested in running Ratchet Bomb for whatever reason, I'm not actually 100% sure if Ratchet Bomb is legal in Explorer right now. If it's not, then this is an interesting addition there, but I have seen Ratchet Bomb see play in the past. It's an interesting addition to Khan wish boards if you need to be able to kill tokens. Like if creativity becomes popular, it's a great addition there as well. So not 100% sure this is going to see play because Ratchet Bomb doesn't see a ton of play right now, and this is very, very marginally better. The 10 damage that this can deal is not anywhere near good enough to make Ratchet Bomb more of a playable card, but if you're interested in playing Ratchet Bomb, this is largely strictly better, so it's worth noting for that reason. Next up, we've got Mercurial Spelldancer. This is a 2-mana 2/1 Phyrexian Rogue. Can't be blocked, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may remove 2 oil counters from it. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So the only reason I'm talking about this is because it's a rogue, and I do think rogues is a potentially powerful deck. And the big issue I've had with rogues in the past is that it has a few really good creatures. I think the Soaring Thought Thief, I think is what it's called, and the have I forgotten the name of it? The really powerful 1-mana creature with Flash that mills the opponent on ETB and then turns into a 3/2 with Death Touch. I think those two are incredibly powerful cards, and I think the blue-black tempo game plan that Rogues has is really powerful, but the next best rogues really aren't that great past that. A Mercurial Spelldancer does seem potentially really powerful in that sort of shell. You play it on turn 2, you get to attack with it every turn and it can't be blocked. You're going to be casting into sorceries as part of your game plan, and then being able to use this to copy an Into the Story or copy a Drown in the Lock to counter one spell and kill one of their creatures seems potentially powerful. Now again, this does seem like quite a hard card to evaluate in a tempo shell like that, so there's a chance it's not good enough in Rogues, and obviously, Rogues isn't a great deck right now anyway, so there's a chance that it's not great there either. And in general, my main hesitation I have with this card is that it also doesn't mill the opponent in any way, and that seems quite important at enabling the best cards in Rogues, which are generally Drown in the Lock and Into the Story, so not 100% sure about this one, but I felt like it was worth talking about because I've always felt like Rogues is a deck where if you could get another 4 of good creature in that deck has the potential to be really good. But so yeah, I'm not 100% sure on this one, but I think it's worth talking about. Next up, we've got Soulless Jailer. So this is a 2-mana 0/4. It's a colorless artifact creature Phyrexian Golem. Permanent cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield, and players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyards or exile. So I was initially a lot higher on this card than I am right now. So the reason I like this card quite a lot is that it's graveyard hate on a creature that doesn't shut off Collected Company. So if you're running a Collected Company creature deck, you can Collected Company into this, and it doesn't shut off your Collected Company, but it does shut off the opponent's graveyard. Now, initially I was very high on it because I thought it was like a Grafdigger's Cage that allowed you to play it off Collected Company, but from what I've heard, if I understand this correctly, this doesn't stop stuff being cast from the graveyard, because something like a Croxer, for example, enters from the stack and not the graveyard. So this is only going to stop stuff like Arclight Phoenix and reanimation spells and like Greasefang bringing back Parhelion, if my understanding of this is correct. So it's a lot more narrow than I initially thought. If this did start off stuff like Croxa, I think this would see a decent amount of play because it has a lot more applications. But, you know, right now in the context of Historic, for example, or I guess Explorer as well, it's only really going to shut off Phoenix, Greasefang, and what was the third one I was thinking of? Oh, Reanimation. So because that's quite narrow, I'm not really sure. If you're playing a Collected Company deck and you wanted to improve your matchup against those 3 decks, it could potentially be an option there, but the fact it doesn't stop stuff like Croxa is a little bit annoying. It makes it a lot worse than I initially thought. Next up, we've got Skrelv's Hive. So this is a 2-mana enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a 1 life and create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Mite artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't be blocked. And as long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control with Toxic have lifelink. So this is another card that I'm not really sure is going to see play. Now, the only reason I'm kind of interested in this card now, it is kind of similar to Bitter Blossom, obviously. Now, the big drawback of this over Bitter Blossom is that the creatures can't block, which is one of the big advantages of a card like Bitter Blossom or like Oni Cult Anvil, for example. So I think the only place that this would potentially see play is in decks that care about having a high density of artifacts. So, you know, you could run this in the sideboard of Blue-White Affinity, for example, against Control. I mean, again, to be honest, if you're playing Blue-White Affinity against Control, you should probably just be sideboarding counter spells because Divine Purge is like the most important card to stop in that matchup. But if there was a deck that cared about having a high density of artifacts, this could be interesting. But outside of that, since the creatures can't block, I'm not really sure. But I felt it was worth talking about because creating artifact creature tokens every single turn seems like it could be important for certain decks going forwards. Next up, we've got Mondrak's Glory Dominus. This is a 4-mana 4/4, and it says, if 1 or more tokens will be created under your control, twice that many of those tokens are created instead. And then it has the same thing as the other Phyrexian horror we saw earlier. It has 1 and 2 white of Phyrexian mana, so you know, you could pay 3 or you could pay 1 and 4 life. Sacrifice 2 other artifacts and/or creatures to put an indestructible counter on it. So again, this seems like a very powerful card that doesn't have a good home, really. This is obviously meant to be played in token decks, so the important thing to note with this is it doesn't just multiply creature tokens. So if you're running a deck like Cat Oven or Oni Cult Anvil, or you know, you're making blood tokens or treasure tokens or clue tokens, it doubles up all of those as well. Now, it being white and double pip white does mean that I'm not really sure this is going to see a great home. You know, the immediate things that come to mind is stuff like Oni Cult Anvil, stuff like Cat Oven, you know, I'd love if this was playable alongside Chatterfang in Historic, for example, but being 2 white does mean that the splash to run this in artifact decks is going to be difficult. Sorry, in token decks is going to be difficult. Now there have been dedicated creature token decks in the past. You know, we've seen stuff like Intangible Virtue and Transmogrify in Historic, but if you're running Transmogrify on tokens in Historic, I think Elesh, Norn, or Creative Behemoth are generally better targets. So this definitely seems like a card that is very powerful but just doesn't have a good deck. If they print more good token generators in future, then this is definitely one to bear in mind for there as well. And then finally, we've got Gleeful Demolition. So this is a 1-mana sorcery, destroy target artifact, and if you control that artifact, create 3/1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens. So this just seems like a nice sideboard card in decks that are making a lot of artifact tokens. So, you know, if you're running a deck that makes a lot of blood tokens or treasure tokens or Oni Cult Anvil tokens, this seems like a really nice, efficient sideboard answer against decks that are running artifacts that you can also just use to put 3/1/1s into play for 1 mana, which is a very good rate as well. So again, I'm not 100% sure this has a great home right now, but if there is a deck that runs, you know, Oni Cult Anvil or treasure tokens, or, you know, if you're running artifact lands, you can use this to target your own Darksteel Citadel, for example, that it won't die and you get 3/1/1. So just a nice sideboard option that's worth bearing in mind going forward. So that's all the cards that I picked out from the set. I do think that this set, you know, there aren't as many impactful cards as we saw in Brothers War. I do think there are definitely some that are likely to see play, but I think most of the cards that I spoke about are more likely to see fringe play or sideboard play. The main ones that I'm really excited to try out is stuff in Kethis combo. I think Kethis combo getting, you know, 2 or 3 potentially nice additions to that deck that is already pretty powerful. Seems like a deck that I'm really excited to try out. I'm also really happy to see Elesh Norn as a sideboard Hushbringer that kind of breaks the symmetry on that sort of effect. So there's a bunch of different cards that I'm really excited to test out from this set. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's any cards that I missed out. Definitely let me know if you can think of any other applications of these cards that I've spoken about that I didn't speak about, because, you know, it is very hard just evaluating cards without having to play with them. You know, it's also very easy to miss some applications or some kind of nice synergies with cards that are already in the format as well. So definitely let me know in the comments what you think of the set, if I've missed any cards out, and if there are any nice interactions that I might have missed out with these cards as well. But anyway, that's the set review. I'm really excited to try it out. I'm going to be brewing a ton of decks when it releases on the 7th, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Big up!